Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome back the one and only Chris Knowles for something of a deep dive on the latest and in all likelihood last ever season of The X-Files. I'd been going over in my head what my opinions of the final episode in particular were, given that it was, the last ever episode. And Chris had been cryptically mentioning that, despite the near consensus opinion that it is awful, it's actually really good, and it's just that nobody knows what was in it, or nobody saw what he saw. So he fell right into that trap, and was forced to come back on the show to discuss it. Along the way, we also talk about X-Files from a cultural significance perspective, what it was trying to tell us from a creative and also parapolitical angle, and what the difference between these two recent seasons and the originals might say about our world. Spoiler alert, there are spoilers ahead. Mr. Knowles, welcome back.
Wonderful to be here.
Yes. So I have many personal questions about X-Files Season 11, and I hope that will trigger some sort of wider discussions on the X-Files in general and so on. But I guess this kind of came about because I shared a couple of articles with you to do with the general negative impression of the final episode. And for people listening, we're about to spoil the shit out of a lot of stuff, obviously.
This is going to be a spoiler frenzy. So
this is going to unpick
your loins.
Yes, in tremendous detail. But I guess we maybe should start setting the scene. It's a difficult question. I don't know if I have an answer to this yet, but what is Season 11 about in aggregate? Is there something it's about in aggregate?
Well, first of all, it's about sort of removing the stain on the X-Files legacy left by Season 10, which nobody thought was anything but a train wreck, it seems. You'll see some people defend it on various, really hardcore X-Files fan boards, but I think that everybody, including the people involved in making it, were just like, oh, this is terrible. So this did not work. So I think that in that regard, it was a very good way to wrap up the story. Even though we're so far removed from, that first flush of X-Files zeitgeist capturing and being at the center of the entertainment world, as it were. But I think that it was just a good way to wrap things up and just give fans a little bit of that classic X-Files taste, to be left in the palate, except, rather than this just weird mess that Season 10 was. Okay,
so I like that angle, because one of the things I want to ask, and we could do it now, is how... Because Season 10 wasn't that good. Season 10 in aggregate, in a funny way, so Season 11's almost a do-over. Because I think Season 10 in aggregate is about William and is about that X-Files essence. It's just they didn't deliver very well on it, as you mentioned. And Season 11...
Not at all. You're being very kind. It was just...
Well, I liked a couple of the episodes you didn't in Season 10. 11 is provably better. There's no question. And it wasn't especially good in aggregate. But so I like that idea of the taste, because there were some of the sort of non-myth arc episodes in the middle that I quite enjoyed. But before we get to them, how do you think it works? So how do you solve for the "and then I woke up" factor? Because if Season 10 ends with a UFO on a bridge over the Potomac, everyone's dying of an illness, and then they kind of left the door open in Season 11 as to how they're going to fold that back into, it's just business as usual now. It's Scully and Mulder in the basement, blah, blah, blah. How do you think it works? How does that fit? Because maybe I missed something somewhere. I don't get how they manage that jump and which one is real and which one isn't.
Well, there are two things to sort of look at here. First of all, there are a lot of hints throughout this season that this is taking place in an alternate reality, that this entire season is not actually taking place in, canonical, continuity X-Files world. It's taking place in some different kind of reality that, Scully was just sort of removed from. And it's interesting because the entire season I was really kind of expecting the final scene to be, back on the bridge, that this was all just like some sort of Jacob's Ladder experience that Scully was processing while facing, not only her own imminent death, but the death of everything. So, I mean, they didn't choose to go there. See, here's the thing. There's this notion that Carter is really, he's all about the mythology, that's his main focus. I don't think that at all. I don't think that Carter really cares about the mythology at all. I think he stopped caring about the mythology at the end of season 8 with the episode Existence, which, ends with that great pullback on Mulder and Scully and William. I think that was the end of their story for him. I think as far as the mythology arc, as we know it, the colonization and black oil and all these kind of things. I think that Carter sort of said what he wanted to say with that just epical, just indelible 3-parter of Anasazi, Blessing Way, and Paperclip. And that's sort of like, it's like that's Carter blowing his mythology load. Because if you look at what's going on behind the scenes, Carter really hands off the mythology. He gives the keys to the car to his partner, Frank Spotnitz, who really becomes the man who's basically doing the lion's share of the plotting and is basically, the overlord of the continuity and just basically the custodian, as it were. And Carter sort of just, would come in and out. And, he was definitely involved, and he's definitely heavily involved and maybe more involved than most showrunners would be in a subplot in another series. But I just don't think that was his focus. I think that after Paperclip, when he just basically said his piece, he said what he had to say and did it so brilliantly. I think he wanted to move on to other kinds of things and just explore other kind of storytelling. And he's a very restless kind of guy. I mean, look at all the wild experiments with form that his own sort of solo episodes became. For instance, Triangle, which is basically an old Shadow comic book plot. Combined with Hitchcock's Rope and Wizard of Oz, and just sort of thrown into this brilliant blender with these 11-minute tracking shots, and things like again the comic books with Postmodern Prometheus and sort of this tribute to James Whale and to classic Hammer horror and Universal horror. I think that's really more his focus. I don't think that he was really focused on the mythology. I think that Frank Spotnitz sort of like is the silent partner here, the people who everyone overlooks. But I think what happened is that when they said, "Oh, we've got to bring the X-Files back," it's always like, you've got to wrap up the mythology. I mean, I don't know if anybody knows, but when they did the second X-Files movie, what they did is and I don't think anybody knows except for me, to be honest with you. But basically, they just took all the bullet points of the classic mythology arc and just put it in a real world context. So like people are being abducted and their bodies are being used for medical experiments by aliens, in this case, Russians, in the middle of the deepest corners of middle America. I mean, it was basically the mythology arc, but put into a very grim and dour real world context. And I think a lot of people have problems with that, but they didn't understand. Carter is a guy, he's extraordinarily intelligent, but he's also crazy, and he's also incredibly fractal. And I think he's constantly playing this weird, like, 5th, 6th, 7th dimensional chess that he expects us to sort of come along with him. But, he's got to, throw more breadcrumbs down, for people to follow. I don't think he's ever really kind of understood that with these kind of things. But at the same time, I think that, his main focus in the last season was Babylon, which, is a train wreck, but it's a fascinating train wreck. And it's just like, the whole thing with this whole mythology was really about hallucinogenic mushrooms all along, and the mystery religions. I almost kind of felt like he wrote that episode for me personally. To be honest
so
with you.
did I. Yeah.
And in this series, we had that thing with Plus One, which is just like classic Off His Meds Carter, which, again, sort of wanders into the synchromistic bailiwick with the whole thing with the name game. I mean, it's basically an episode about name game magic. So
that's a really good example of that kind of, I guess, that leave the taste on the palate, because I enjoyed that one. For people who have watched it, that's the one with the telepathic game of Hangman with this brother and sister who are feuding, and you get doppelgangers, and it was like being back in Vancouver.
Oh, it really? Well, first of all, you were back in Vancouver, and that actress who played both the brother and the sister is Karen Knoble, who people will remember from that episode Home, that sort of Hills Have Eyes episode with the inbred family. That was the same actress, and she did a fantastic job on that, I think.
So, I mean, let's bring it back to this, because I still don't know. We were talking about it as the show was going on, and one of my speculations was that all of season 11 is some kind of projection from William into Scully's mind, and I assumed the same thing, that it would end up on the bridge. But I still can't.
It still might be. I mean, in Carter's mind, it still might be. He will never tell you the truth. I mean, the man is a friggin' sphinx, you know what I'm saying?
Right, so it's not just me. We don't have clarity. It's deliberately left open as to how we go from the jump from being on the bridge in Washington to My Struggle 3 in the beginning of season 11, and then it's just this kind of reset, and even Skinner's being fishy again. He's one of my favorites, and I don't think he got the send-off that maybe I would have liked him to have. Funnily enough, you mentioned the movies. I think he got quite a good send-off in the second film. And then when they play the kind of theme music when he shows up on camera towards the end, I think it's been an interesting kind of farewell. I like the idea of it, but I just want to be clear that it's not just me completely missing it then. It's deliberately left open as to how you make the jump from season 10 to 11.
Well, I mean, that's this is my theory. I don't think that anybody, when working on season 10, was like, we're going to do a season 11. I don't think anybody thought that. I thought they just thought that this is just like a little mini series. This is just a little gift for the fans. We're going to do this. It's going to be one and done, and we're going to move on to whatever we're going to do next. And I think Carter just was like, okay, well, you were complaining all these years that we were promising, of the apocalypse and never delivered. Well, here it is. And, and when he delivers it, I mean, everybody complains. So, I mean, it's like X-Files fandom is very interesting. And it's interesting because a lot of the people who write like these articles and these websites and stuff, come out of the fandom. And it's an incredibly like weird and dysfunctional fandom that really in the early to mid 2000s was really not very well regarded by other fandoms, in sort of the fandom pecking order. They were sort of like disreputable at that point because it had become such a hothouse. It had become such a just a constant flame war in that fandom that it really turned a lot of people off. And people who left the fandom, who got into other fandoms. I mean, it's a whole big story. It's like you could write a book on it because it really ties into the whole rise of internet culture and trolling and all this kind of social churn that we're seeing today. In large part, sort of had maybe like not a birth, but sort of like a midwifing in X-Files fandom in the 90s. So when you're reading a lot of these articles, I mean, X-Files fans love to complain. They love to bitch. They love to take shots at Chris Carter. And it sort of, I think it impacts the way people perceive the series as a whole. But also, I mean, you had, to be blunt here, I mean, you had sort of Gillian Anderson basically very, oh, who, me, not me. I mean, this kind of attitude where she's basically trying to jettison, any chances of success the series would have because, she kicks in with this whole thing about, women directors and women writers on the series. And then, that starts this just massive flame war. And that's even before Not Me, but, with that whole sort of crowd, Twitter, Tumblr crowd. And then, and not saying, that there isn't a point there, but it's just like there's a way that you sort of deal with these things. And in one sense that she was actually wrong, because one of the female directors on the show was actually hired before she tweeted that. But then they had this big rollout at the New York Comic Con in October, and she basically told everyone that she was quitting the show and she wasn't going to do a season 12. And I think that just really took the air right out of it. I mean, you're starting to see a little buildup as far as excitement, and then she just sort of punctured it. And then, in this season, there's been some other examples like that. So, I mean, it's sort of hard for people to see from the outside, but, when you see these tweets that she makes, but when all you need to see is the reaction, in the threads, and you'll see, the impact that had. I mean, if Gillian Anderson doesn't want to do another series, I certainly don't blame her. I mean, she's not young. She lives in London. Vancouver is not a very nice place to be in the winter. So, I mean, whatever, I don't blame her, but there's just a way of handling it. So, I mean, I think that there was this sort of, not necessarily a perfect storm, but there was just sort of this growing sort of clamor that I think impacted, in many ways, how the series was going to be regarded. And also, I mean, to be perfectly frank and blunt again, I mean, the opening episode of this season was just fucking train wreck. It was just an abomination.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I just kind of sense that because Ann Simon, who's the was one of Carter's closest friends and also the scientific advisor on the series, she had tweeted like a few days before they were supposed to start shooting, "Oh, Chris just finished the script for season, 1 opener." And I'm like, "Oh, great. Isn't he supposed to be shooting now?" I mean, it's just like, and this is what I'm saying. I don't think there's a real gun to your head feeling with the first 3 My Struggles. Maybe not the first one in some regards, but definitely the second and third one. I just think I don't think he's really focused on this. I don't think he really cares about this. I think there's a real feeling of contractual obligation here that the network is saying, you've got to continue on with the storyline and everything. And he's got a lot of ideas and a lot of themes that he wants to play with, but I just don't think he really knew what he wanted to say about them.
Well, it's called My Struggle. It's called My Struggle.
Well, that's my joke is it's the title means my struggle with writing these scripts.
Yeah. Well, that was, I mean, I think you maybe picked up the tone there quite well, because he should delight in it. He should, do you know what I mean? If we expect him to delight in it and they just a weird mismatch, and also kind of hostile to fandom. You have the Joel McHale character, who's basically, I mean, Alex Jones thinks it's Alex Jones, and it is, but it's also, it's quite hostile to the edges of X-Files fandom and so on, and it is kind of a mess. And so do you think maybe it was, because here's the thing, My Struggle, I like 1. My Struggle 4 is okay. It feels unbelievably rushed. I've never seen it. It's like they were actually, in my memory, they're even acting fast. And so, yeah, I guess it's just quite uneven in that sense. But you get a feel that it's rushed, and maybe he could have maybe had My Struggle 1 and 4 in him, and 2 and 3 are just blah.
Well, yeah, I mean, 2 and 3 are terrible, and it's interesting too because one of the things that I've always really picked up on, and I don't think a lot of people have picked on it, but everybody sort of really likes to complain about, this dialogue that he lapses into in these mythology, this sort of purpley, prosy, very stilted dialogue that you see in so many of the mythology episodes. I mean, even in the classic days. But really, I mean, I recognize it because, I cut my teeth on that stuff. And but basically, it's Stan Lee dialogue. It's classic Silver Age Marvel Comics. Maybe even more Roy Thomas, ripping off Stan Lee than Stan Lee himself. Stan Lee was a little bit more artful than the people who came later and were basically doing, cover acts of him. But I mean, I can just tell that Chris Carter read a shit ton of Marvel comics when he was a kid, because that's what that dialogue is. I mean, if you took those screenshots and then just put those word balloons, of that dialogue as is, and then maybe did like a few little tricks in Photoshop to make the photos look like cartoons or something, run it through a few filters. I mean, it would just be like people would think it was like a great comic, but great comics don't make for great television. And, this whole idea with Mulder and these just completely extraneous monologues. And in My Struggle 3, when he's driving around, it's like, which skull, I was like, he's been reading Frank Miller comics. I mean, that's Sin City right there. I mean, that's exactly Sin City. And, it's sort of this like hard boiled Sin City dialogue, all you can picture is like Josh Brolin, pretending to drive in this old, Buick in this sort of CGI environment. And I think Carter's like, I kind of like that. Maybe I should try that. It's just like, that's what I get the sense of this, the My Struggles. It's just like throw everything that I like and see if it becomes a story. And it really didn't. But as far as My Struggle 4 is, and it's like, this is the problem with My Struggle 4, is that everybody watches that and expects it to be a mythology episode and sort of tie everything up and tie up all the loose ends and blah, 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 blah. I don't think that's what he was trying to do at all. I think what he was trying to do was do a classic Monster of the Week episode. And basically the joke here is that, the child of Mulder and Scully and whatever kind of scientific mumbo jumbo smoking men sort of performed on, Scully's uterus whenever, they basically created, the most dangerous X-Files monster ever, like the most dangerous. I mean, this is like the beast of the apocalypse. And sort of that, classic Apocalypse Now scene that is basically a replay of Erlenmeyer Flask. And there's also a lot of riffs from Erlenmeyer Flask in that episode. He's, the whole thing with the chase. I mean, that's straight out of Erlenmeyer Flask, but it's also straight out of Herrenvolk, which is the season 4 opener with the Jeremiah Smith and Mulder running from the alien bounty hunter. But then, the joke is that William is, he's a shapeshifter like the alien bounty hunter. So it's like, he's kind of like, he's got the powers of all the worst X-Files monsters that Mulder and Scully ever faced, but he's also their son. So I think that people weren't expecting it, and people weren't really, didn't necessarily want to see that, but I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I thought the direction was like cinema worthy. I mean, Carter is, whatever criticism you can make of Carter, and you can make a lot. He's a brilliant visual director. I mean, he's got a sense for the creating the uncanny out of the natural that I think is just unbelievably underappreciated. I mean, we saw this in the second X-Files movie when he's really making use of the very painterly use of this bleak British Columbia mountain landscape to really tell the story of what I've written about several times, that movie is basically a number of different mystery religion dramas rolled into one. But the way he kind of does that. So, I mean, that's the problem with Carter, is that there's too many balls juggling in his head, and he thinks that everybody's going to follow him on all these tangents, and they don't necessarily do so. But as far as, what people saw as rushed and everything like that, I saw as excitement, as action. It's like the one criticism that I could make of this season is a little kind of like, it was a little low T, it was a little male menopause. It was just a little kind of like, whatever. I mean, we're telling good stories here, but, we're in no hurry here. And this was like, zam, it was kind of like, oh man, I just got some Adderall in my system and I'm ready to rock. I felt that the series really needed that. So I think that people are going to look back, once all the cultural baggage is taken away, and once all the expectations, and, once the fandom sort of dissolves a bit more, and maybe we get some more objective thinkers, in the media, I think people are going to come to see it for what it is. And it's just basically Carter just subverting his own expectations and taking, and this is an interesting thing, because you have to look at Ghoulie, the James Wong episode, and this episode is bookends, because what Ghoulie did is it starts off as a Monster of the Week episode, classic X-Files, on a boat in the middle of nowhere, two teen girls from middle America, finding themselves confronted by this horrible creature. But then you realize that, oh, wait, this isn't really a Monster of the Week episode. This is a mythology episode. It's actually a rather traditional, sort of stolid, foursquare mythology episode. And then Carter just basically says, well, I'm going to just reverse that equation. You're going to think this is a mythology episode, but it's really just a Monster of the Week episode, because that's really what I'm interested in saying. That's really what I'm interested in doing. This whole mythology thing, it came because Jillian got pregnant, and all these things sort of happened. But really, what I'm interested in is just telling like weird monster stories, and I think that maybe people just don't expect that.
So My Struggle 4, this is interesting to me, is the point, if you will, is kind of very Twilight Zone, like, turns out it's man. So the monster at the end which is an amalgam of so many of them, which is William, wouldn't have existed if they hadn't gone on their monster quest from the very beginning, which is kind of him playing with this idea that Monsters of the Week, rather than mythology, is actually what the X-Files is about. Is that kind of where maybe I've missed him?
I think I think if Carter had his druthers, that if the mythology doesn't take on a life of its own, like I said, he physically removed himself from, the central plotting of the stories and handed it over as early as, Nisai 731 to Frank Spotnitz. And technically speaking, this whole process really starts with Colony Endgame, with the clones and the alien bounty hunter in season 2. So, and that whole storyline doesn't really have anything to do with Anasazi and Blessing Way and Paperclip, which is Carter sort of writing the great American tragedy of the post-war era. So I think that I think in many ways, and it's like I just don't think he's as invested in the mythology as people think he is. I think he sort of felt a sense of obligation, because it's so many of the themes that he's writing about are so deeply personal to him, in more ways than one. So I think that he felt like a sense of obligation to these stories. But I think what he was more interested in the mythology for was the emotional lives of the characters. I think that was really his focus, insofar as how do these characters respond emotionally. And it sort of became almost like this family drama, the Spender family and the Mulder family, and then the Scully family, these sort of three American families that worked for this evil behemoth of a government, in the post-war era. I think that's, and all the stuff with the Black Oil. The Black Oil is Frank. A lot of the stuff that people think is Carter is actually Frank. And, Frank's more like, oh, let's bring this to Russia and make this sort of like a John le Carre novel for a couple episodes. All that kind of stuff. I think Carter was more interested in is how do the characters respond to this? How does this affect their relationship? How does this affect their relationship with their family? And it's, a lot of people just won't see this because they have these preconceptions, but look at those episodes and look at the focus when he was really involved in the mythology in season 8, when it really became just about the abduction of Mulder. The super soldier stuff, that's Frank. That's the next season, when Frank is basically the showrunner. In season 8, he's what Carter's concerned about is the relationships, and it's almost like that season was not only bringing it back to basics with more classic kind of Vancouver monster stories, but really, bringing it back to basics with, what is the mythology all about? The mythology is all about people getting sucked up into this fucking engine of death and just being spat out the other end. I think that's more what he's interested in. So I think the fact that, so much of My Struggle, and again, I can't help but think that it's a little pun on his part, is really just him not having any center here and not having any emotional investment in the storyline anymore, and just not knowing what to write about. So just kind of taking just a grab bag of things, throwing it all together and hoping a story comes out of it. And it didn't. And it really, I think he sort of, with My Struggle 4, is him admitting defeat in a sense. It's well, if this is probably my last X-Files episode ever, I'm just going to tell the kind of story that I like. If people don't like it, fuck them. I don't care. I'm just going to do a really cool monster story with all this stuff about the government and, and all this creepy stuff, that I'm interested in. But there's a MacGuffin here. There's a center here, and that's this whole battle over William. And I just, like I said, I think he was out there half-heartedly kind of trying to sell this whole idea of like this new mythology. I just don't think he cares. I really don't. And you can just tell the level of the writing. Babylon is like just a bizarre train wreck of an episode, but it's just so much more focused and even though it's not necessarily linear, but it's like there's a tightness and a sharpness and a focus that you just don't see in those other episodes.
There's joy in it as well. You can see him enjoying
exactly. it. Yeah. Well, and also with Plus One, I think he really enjoyed it. I think he was that's like Carter having fun. And having fun is like this crazy story about these mental patients who play this telepathic game of hangman. I mean, what are the mechanics of this? What is the internal logic of it? Who cares? It's just like, I just want to have fun here. I just like tell this cool story and have people die in interesting and cool ways,
In Babylon, the camera shots of looking back at David Duchovny's face when he's high and walking through the hospital, and then the kind of line dancing club scene and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they are friends in real life. A complicated friendship, evidently, but they're friends in real life, and you kind of get more of the... We used to enjoy this, and we're enjoying it again, that I guess I was looking for in season 11. And there were glimmers of that, I think, in Duchovny, the sort of witchcraft episode. I think he enjoyed parts of that, though you can kind of get it there. But I was looking for it in My Struggle, and yeah, I struggled.
Well, I think he was having a blast in My Struggle 4. It's like, see, this is Duchovny's whole thing, is that he really smart people get bored easily. You know that because you're the smartest person I've ever met. So I mean, you understand that. So I think whatever you can say about David Duchovny, and you can certainly make criticism about a lot of his performances over the years, but he's incredibly intelligent. I mean, he's scary smart. And that's the thing that really blew me away when I was working on the book and reading all these interview transcripts. It's like, oh my God, everybody who worked on this series was really intelligent. I mean, even people look at Robert Patrick and think he's like a decent dem kind of guy, just working class, all this kind of bullshit. He's really intelligent and he's really smart. I mean, he doesn't show up, but if you read his interview transcripts, it's like, this guy is bright. He's on the ball. So I think that I think Duchovny really enjoyed that Carter gave him something different to do. Not just like Mulder just wandering around dour faced with his black trench coat, trying to impact a world that he no longer understands. It's like he becomes like Liam Neeson or something. I think that
I get that. I think he played kind of fatherhood quite well, because even in 3, in a way, you've got there's an emotionality to the stakes because it is actually his kid. I get that in it. That was probably the bit I enjoyed in My Struggle 4. I also think he did, as you say, Liam Neeson. I think he enjoyed the shooting bit. I think he enjoyed shooting that Syndicate secret space program guy at the desk and what have you. But that was kind of going to be one of my points. If I think in aggregate, you're right that Carter's mythology focus is, and it's a good one, and it's important, and no one else has probably told it as well, is the Cold War bloodthirsty machine and the people that it ate, which is one of the reasons why a recurring motif is, of course, the cruelty to children and abduction of children and all this stuff that we know happened. Testing of different vaccines and all this kind of awful things that employees of the US and to a lesser extent British government did during the Cold War. So I think that's there, but there's just kind of when I look at some of the mythology stuff, and I'm going to turn it into a season 11 question, although we've probably answered it. Even when you include the movies, which I'm also a fan of as well, if you look at the kind of high points of what X-Files may have told us, you have space viruses, you have an ancient alien ship in Antarctica, and you have the Russians. And that pretty much describes last year.
Yeah.
And you think, well, if you can look at the black oil as you say, that's a bit more of a Sputniks thing. But if you look at what that's saying, and I just wonder, has the world changed, or is there a sense of frustration, or it doesn't even really matter anymore in season 10 and 11, where before, when it was zeitgeisty, there was stuff, in the spin-off show, they fly a plane into the World Trade Center. Like, there's some stuff in here, right? And I just wonder, is the Joel McHale character the showrunners going like, you have missed it and it doesn't even really matter anymore because, Chris, the microbes are ready?
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing about this episode is that it was kind of like, it's kind of like a band. There are a lot of bands that stick around for a long time. They go through their ups and downs, and then like out of nowhere, they'll create an album that just really recaptures that vibe that everybody sort of glommed onto and loved them for in the first place. And I think that was sort of the mission in this season, was to just when did we really love this? When were we having fun? That was when we were in Vancouver, when we were telling these kind of stories. We're putting these things in the context of things going on outside. There was always, particularly in the first season, all these monsters were kind of like, and this is what James Wan kind of, he tied the bow with Founder's Mutation, which basically said, all these monsters you've been seeing, over the past 10 seasons in the show, well, basically they're all products of, experimentation, genetic experimentation with alien DNA. And and then I think that he sort of revisits that when he basically takes that same concept that we saw with this character that, nobody even remembers, Kyle Gilligan was his name, this boring generic character that nobody cared about. And he says, well, what this is really about is this is about William. So, and William is like a character that nobody wanted, that everyone hated. I mean, everyone, it's so funny. It's like, oh, how could you do this, William? Wait a second. Let's go back, internet wayback machine, and just read you personally telling the world how much you hated William and hope he died in a fire and all this kind of thing. So, I mean, I think that, they don't ever telegraph this stuff, and they want you to figure it out for yourself. And we're kind of at a point now where people just are not even interested enough to do that anymore. And even if they could, they don't lack the cognitive skills to do so. So I think that in this sense, it's like, but they wanted to tie it all together. And I think that, again, this is why I think My Struggle 4 is genius, because for the valedictory message of this show, it's like, Mulder was sort of like a Faust character. He's looking for that, what is the truth? And it's funny in Babylon when, there's that whole hallucination scene, and he goes down to, Hades and the river Styx and everything. And the smoking man's there, and he's Charon. And he's like, you want the truth? This is what the truth is. It's hell. And that's sort of like, kind of being revisited in this last episode as well. So, it's kind of like, it reminds me of John Dee, or Faust. I mean, I don't know how much of Faust is based on John Dee. I kind of imagine that a lot of it is. But, it's just these kind of figures that they're looking to storm heaven and don't realize that heaven is a lot more like hell than anybody would actually want to admit,
Okay, I get that. Yes,
Did I answer your question? I
think so. My estimation of My Struggle 4 has improved. It's weird. Like, one of the questions I had about it is, am I going to like it more if I just watch My Struggle 1 to 4 all the way through? And I could probably stand to lose 2 and 3, I think, at this point. But I also... Because what I've been looking for in series 10 and 11 is the thing that turns out to be correct. And I think we just kind of touched on it there, because there's been a load of them, as I said. Space viruses, I mean, where to begin? They're talking about the transgenic stuff, the Antarctica thing, when you consider Fight the Future. Like, these are examples. Back in the day, either they knew stuff or...
Hold on a sec. I mean, Antarctica, you got to go back to, I mean, not necessarily Antarctica, but it's like that whole thing was like first explored in Colony Endgame. So that's like as far back as the second season. So
yeah, well, you got the kind of... anyway, and I'm just trying to look if there is something
Tales
like
being
that.
told out of schools.
Yeah, and I think we sort of hit on it there. And for me, the key of it is the Joel McHale character, which is like, we did just tell you 20 years ago, we told you stuff that is now current events. And you are all watching Alex Jones. And I just kind of wonder if, rather than a tale being told out of school, I wonder if, because we've spoken about this offline, the recurring motif is space viruses and microbes being ready, to use your term, right? The recurring motif is that it is the stuff to look for in the stars is a virus, and its impact has already happened to mankind, which we know. And I've had Dr. Chandra Wickramasinghe on the show to talk about stuff like that. And also, when you look at where we're going from a medicalization and CRISPR and whatever perspective, we had a 20-year heads up on it. And I'm just wondering if there's anything in this, or is it just, look, it's going to happen and you guys are all going to be watching Alex Jones?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't even, it's funny because, I mean, I just want to we'll touch on just, a different episode here and sort of double back to that. But let me just, talk about like this whole thing that Darren Morgan was exploring in Forehead Sweat. This whole idea of like, well, you're so concerned about the truth and what's the truth, and, the truth will set you free. And that, the truth is just entirely subjective and provisional and not even a fixed idea in the minds of truth seekers. That the truth is just, it's becoming entirely amorphous now. So it's like the romantic quest of this search for the truth, that if we just find out the truth, we can fix things, we can change things, we can avert this disaster that we're all on. We can steer the Titanic away from the iceberg. I think that Darren Morgan really spoke to that in his way that he always does, where he always sort of cannily grasps the themes that are being explored by his paymasters and then subverts them. So, in this sense that, this whole idea that, with like the Mengele effect or the Mandela effect, whatever you wish to call it, where like, reality can just be overwritten because, and this is like a real life thing now, because we're talking about like AIs being able to make sunny days into rainy days and vice versa, and just being able to graft famous actors' faces onto hardcore porno movies. I mean, we're looking at the collapse of truth. Truth is no longer. Nobody even cares about truth anymore. You know what I mean? It was interesting because I was watching this thing with Jordan Peterson, and he's talking about the word, and like this whole idea of like the word in the Gospels, and this whole idea of the word in Christianity. And I thought it was interesting, and it was an interesting argument to make. But I just kind of thinking, it's like, Jordan, I mean, you're the horse is gone and the barn door is wide open. I mean, it's like the ship has sailed. I mean, whatever cliche you choose to use, it's like. It's trying to recreate a world that is, in fact, lost to us forever. As long as we have these electronics that are just metastasizing and multiplying, this whole quest, to return to the simplicity of the logos and the word, it's just not going to happen. It's just it cannot happen. Even if we wanted to, even if we all just resolved ourselves to making this happen, it's like. The dissemination of information has made it impossible. And that's why, we're seeing like, all these, the Googles and the Facebooks and, and all these sort of CIA companies, like, it's like, well, you have to, everything's becoming like the Khmer Rouge or East Germany again. That, you have to believe this, and, you'll be penalized. We can ruin your life if you don't believe our truth. And, it's very bare knuckled. I mean, I think that is going to ultimately fail as well. I mean, it almost seems like a sort of a last ditch attempt to put the toothpaste back in the tube. I don't think it's going to happen. But so I think that, he did a great job there. And I think that it kind of informs the rest of the series. And like I said, I just kept getting this sense that this is some alternate reality. This is some alternate reality that maybe is just another one of Williams' visions. I don't know. I mean, I think that Carter would argue, and I think there are reasons to argue that he's showing you in My Struggle 2 that this is William's vision, because there's those close-ups, those zoom-ins to Scully's eye.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's sort of like there's like an outside psychical force, inserting itself into her consciousness. So, you can certainly make that, but that to me is like, Carter to me is always like giving himself like back doors in all this. And I think this is something that is laid throughout the entire series. And it's interesting too, because if you go back, if you look at William, if you look at My Struggle 4, and then you go back to episodes that, fans either hated or didn't watch. I mean, two episodes that I have, a personal connection to, and I really love is Providence and Providence, which is all about like, even as a baby, William is like the most dangerous thing on the planet, because even as a baby, he's, everybody's like, oh, William would never kill these people. He's William. He's wonderful. He's Scully's son, blah, blah, blah. Well, when he was a baby, he incinerated an entire UFO cult because they pissed him off. He's a baby. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, we've already seen how dangerous he is, that he's like the most dangerous thing in the world, even as like a 2-month-old infant. So that doesn't really wash for me. So, but again, I mean, I think that Carter works in on so many different levels, and that maybe he even outsmarts himself more often than not. I mean, you can certainly make that argument, but I think that there's everything that happened in the season that people are complaining about. You can go back and look. I mean, even this thing that people were just like this huge firestorm about, like this whole idea of like, the smoking man is Scully's father and he raped her, and this whole thing, Harvey Weinstein, not me, blah, 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 this whole thing. I mean, I really believe that, people just weren't paying attention, because if you go back and not only just to NME, but also to the, again, these episodes that people didn't watch in the 9th season, where Scully's whole thing is like, where did this baby really come from? How did I actually have this baby? And there's this whole thing with the ship and the embryos being injected with super soldiers and blah, 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 and this whole thing. So, but it's interesting when when you talk about like this, what is going to become the story of our times, this whole idea of transgenics and chimeras and CRISPR and all this other kind of thing. I mean, the X-Files is basically doing that literally in the pilot, because what we think are aliens in the pilot are actually transformed humans. They're actually hybrids. We learned this in Paperclip, that these weird sort of ape-looking human hybrids, that kind of look like classic Greys, but they're actually human beings that have been transformed through hideous medical experimentations. And now those hideous medical experimentations are becoming like superhero origins. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I don't know.
And that's it's weird you mentioned that, because obviously that is. William's story is a kind of Gnostic creation myth of a like Dr. Manhattan or something, which would match with Carter using comic book motifs in the My Struggle episodes, as you say, Mulder driving around, all but with the speech bubble, or thought bubble rather, coming out. And you think there's something, and that's what I was looking for in My Struggle 4. It's almost quasi-Egyptian that your father's really your grandfather, and because of the use of magic, you now have these powers, and you're the thing that's going to permanently change the earth, which is you'll get variants of that kind of multi-generational creation of a Horus or something, which William clearly is. And I'm glad that they put that in there. But the other thing, as you say, you left the door open. I found myself wondering, is he going to hand the show off completely to someone else, and he's just kind of like burning all the files? Because he sort of shuts down the private space program idea with Mulder killing that guy, and then he definitively kills Smoking Man towards the end. And you think, is Fox going to hand this off to someone else, and is he just trying to like make sure they can't touch any of his things? Because that's what I mean by it felt rushed. It felt like the feds are coming, quickly shred everything. And that was...
Shred the documents. Yeah. The all-night shredding party. I think, I mean, I don't know when he sort of landed on this whole concept, but, one thing that I would point out is that he and James Wong did the commentary track for Found His Mutation together. And that was sort of an interesting thing for Carter to do, to sort of take part in an episode that was really somebody else's baby. But I think that there's very good possibility that he and James Wong sort of trading ideas and sort of moving to where they wanted to finish this thing. And I think that if you look at Founder's Mutation, like I would say, you know what I think like the real My Struggle. I mean, you can watch My Struggle 1, because it's a lot more. I don't want to necessarily say coherent, but it seems a lot more craftsman-like than 2 and 3. You can watch My Struggle 1 and then watch Founder's Mutation, and then watch the previously on the X-Files bits just to sort of catch up with the bullet points of the story, and then watch Ghoulie and My Struggle 4, and that to me is the real mythology arc.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Carter's focus really is. I just don't think he cares about the smoking man. I mean, just to bring him back in such an artless way. He's saying, well, he's got some sort of alien technology that can take his cinder of a body that we saw when he was hit in the face with a cruise missile in The Truth and reconstruct it. I mean, it's real. It's not even science anymore. It's just pure. I mean, this is like the classic trope. I mean, this is almost like Robert E. Howard or something, like you can never kill that evil wizard. He's always going to have some magical way to recover, like that whole kind of trope, which again is very comic book. I mean, just the fact that he comes back like that, it's very comic book. And it just kind of shows me that, that effort to ground the mythology and reality that we saw in the first 9 seasons, to greater and lesser extent, of the X-Files, I just think he was just writing a comic book here. And I think that really, in a sense, it's like, all right, I'm getting paid however many millions of dollars to do this thing. And fans are going to bitch no matter what I do. So I'm just going to do whatever. Wouldn't it be fun to do a 70s end of the world plague TV movie for one of the My Struggle? Sure, let's do that. Wouldn't it be fun to sort of do this whole commentary on the late Obama administration and the whole thing with Glenn Beck and Alex Jones? All right, let's do that. And then it's like, wouldn't it be fun to just do just a pure comic book adaptation X-Files episode? All right, we'll make that My Struggle number 3. I mean, I don't think that this was easy for him. Like I said, I do believe it was a struggle, but I think really what he was moving towards, because no matter what the fans say, all they have to do is watch the pilot episode, because everything is laid out there, that everything is about human alien hybrids, and even the second episode, Deep Throat, where everything is about the secret space program. So it's not like this stuff was just popping out of the sky. And I would even argue that this whole idea of this secret space program that we see in sort of the UFO milieu has, is in no small regard influenced by people who were, grew up watching the X-Files. So.
Well, the Syndicate is a perfect example of that. The fact that it is a private program, as far as anybody can tell, or majority private program. That idea predates Richard Dolan's initial exegesis of the secret space program or breakaway civilization by over 10 years.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, I personally believe that, and I want to say it was Stephen Greer, but somebody had sort of, back during the Iran-Contra days, Daniel Inouye, the senator of Hawaii, had talked about that, that there was literally a parallel government that existed, within our own, and it had its own army, and it had its own, its own Air Force, and it had its own CIA, and all these kind of things. And I really think, and then that sort of got filtered in, in the retarded version through this Stephen Greer kind of thing. But I think Carter, maybe that's where he was reminded of it, but he's sort of gone back to that whole Iran-Contra, Bush-Cheney, Kellogg-Brown-Root, DynCorp, Blackwater. I mean, just this whole alternate universe, and that's really kind of the birth of the Syndicate. So I think that again, I think Carter to me is a much better producer than he is a writer in this regard, because that's what a producer does. Just throws a bunch of ideas into the mix, bunch of crazy ideas that nobody else think of, and just give those to the writers and let them sort of construct stories about it. I mean, Carter's downfall in a lot of ways, at least with the fandom and maybe even with the industry, is like this control freak nature he has, where he has to it's a very working class kind of mentality where it's like, it doesn't matter how good it is, it just matters how hard I worked on it. And that's like classic kind of proletarian lunchbox blue collar kind of attitude that I think was the milieu that he grew up in, and I think it really heavily informs his thinking. I think too much so, but also it's like, and that clashes. It's sort of like this weird mix of contrast, because that clashes with this whole surfer stoner, very fractal, way of thinking that informed his later teenage years and into his early 20s and maybe even his early 30s. I mean, that whole milieu, which is very, it's like, hey man, wow, I was riding this tube and it was like, I saw the universe. It's like when you're subject to the forces of the ocean, like a surfer is, your whole worldview changes. It really does. It's because you understand that you are just like this little speck, and that nature is this immensely powerful force that can just crush you at whim whenever it pleases. So, I mean, there's a lot of contradictions here. And I think that those contradictions and that sort of clash of impulses was what made the X-Files so great, because it was like, there's this tension between, this need to hew to tradition and this need to, sort of seize the future and all these kind of things. But also this kind of like, Carter's whole sense of like, well, what would happen, all these other TV shows are going to go this way. What would happen if we like went this way and then did like some wheelies and then some donuts and then, drove off the cliff and then try to get back onto the road? I mean, that's what was really his contribution to the show. It's just this weird, very off kilter, almost like dangerous kind of mentality. And somebody involved in the show actually referred to him at one point in time as a dangerous man. So I think that there's some validity behind this. But it's like what works in the 90s doesn't necessarily work today. And I think that in this there is like a very much of a memory lane kind of walk down here.
Well,
but at the same time,
both of those points is kind of what I was thinking, which is there's a sense in season 10 and 11 of a kind of where are they now episode, it kind of campier than a band reunion a decade later. And I get that, but I also get the sense of where are you now? Like, because we did this in the 90s, and that's where I keep coming back to the sort of Alex Jones. I enjoyed My Struggle one because it's really fun, because I did think, where are they now? I wonder if Scully and Mulder are still together. I wonder if he still lives in that house. And so you kind of got that. And even like joking about we have mobile phones now, and I used mobile phones then. Yeah. But it's like we have Google now. I used to do this in Heels. All those kind of fun kind of throwbacks. It does have a where are they now, but I think the spotlight isn't just on the world of the X-Files, it's on the world. And so if I'm trying to get people to conceptualize how they want to think about 10 and 11 in the context of the wider X-Files universe, I think it does need to be a coda or revisitation. So you can kind of have going from season 1 all the way up to, 9 in the movies and so on, and then just draw a firm line and go, that's it. And then there's this almost meta approach of where are they now and revisitation, and almost like looking at the context of what the show did 20 years later. Because I'm struggling to how I frame it or I guess map it out in my head. And I think a coda or an almost like a after credit sequence, 2 seasons of an after credit sequence kind of idea is where I'm landing on it, because I still don't get the. And the reason, I guess I can tie that into what you were saying about what My Struggle 4 is about, which is, in retrospect, and this is, I'm thinking from a Chris Carter perspective, in retrospect, the X-Files is really about the monsters of the week. And you can kind of get that as the sort of message of 10 and 11. Does that make sense? How do you like my hypothesis?
Well, I like that hypothesis because, again, I'm always like, well, go back to the root of this. And the roots of this entire series are, Chris Carter's love for Kolchak the Night Stalker, which was a monster, like literally was a Monster of the Week episode. So I think that, it's a funny thing because when you're doing a series, if the X-Files was just Monsters of the Week, it would maybe run maybe 1 or 2 seasons and been sort of a cult thing that you would see in interesting back rooms at Dragon Con. You know what I'm saying? It would just be sort of like, without the mythology, without this sort of attempt, however, maybe, I don't know if to say ill-conceived, but maybe like it was not always executed to the best of their abilities. But without the mythology, the Monsters of the Week, it's just a goofy monster show. And it's just basically, it's Friday the 13th, the series, which is a show that had run just prior to the X-Files. And, it even had a redhead and a guy who looked not entirely like the young David Duchovny starring in it. And it was just basically the show about this pawn shop that had, had to recover all these cursed artifacts that the previous owner of the pawn shop, who is, a sorcerer and a black magician, had basically just put out into the world in order to cause mayhem. So without the mythology and without this sort of overarching framework of, government conspiracy, that there's a greater struggle going on here, I don't think the show, again, would have had any impact at all. I think it hit at that right point in time, because if you watch those first 2 episodes, which is, some of Carter's best writing ever, he's laying down all the groundwork for everything that he's interested in. But, you could almost argue that they almost exist as Monsters of the Week themselves. I mean, you never really see the monsters, and the monsters are off camera. But it's like looking for a monster that can't be found. So there's a kind of romanticism to that quest. It's almost like Don Quixote or something. And I think that's what really resonated in that early season. And then, the next episode after Deep Throat is Tombs, and it's sort of like this genetic freak, and it's a little easy to get a handle on for maybe more traditionally minded audiences. But again, if we look at it in the context of this season 11, and to some extent season 10, it's like they always had to tie it together. And I think the down, not necessarily the downfall, but sort of the Achilles heel of the series is that you had the mythology and you had the Monsters of the Week, and they always just kind of seemed like 2 different series running, in parallel courses to one another. And I think that, the thing that it's going to take people some time, the X-Files is going to have to go back into hibernation and be rediscovered again, is, the people are going to sort of recognize that. I think it's ingenious, actually, to say, no, this is all part of one continuity. So in that regard, it's like, the Monsters of the Week, and it isn't just monsters, it's also psychics, and of course, there's a lot of magic and sorcery in the mix as well. I mean, I think everybody sort of said, oh, this is a Monsters of the Week, episodes that really don't have anything to do with monsters. I mean, it's like, followers of, not followers, familiar in this season, the witchcraft episode. That's, people go, oh, that's a Monster of the Week because of Mr. Chuckleteeth and everything. Well, Mr. Chuckleteeth isn't a monster. I mean, Mr. Chuckleteeth is an apparition. So, he doesn't actually exist. The agency here is the witchcraft. So, and we have a lot of those episodes in the history of the series where it's, I think that Carter is much more mystically and magically oriented than people give him not necessarily credit for, but people might necessarily assume. And I think he sort of put more of that into Millennium. That Millennium, starts off as this kind of dark and, dreary premise about, the onrushing apocalypse is, just driving people crazy, and they're all becoming serial killers and stuff. And halfway through the season, it's like, no, what this is really about is that, demons and angels are here in the flesh, and they're battling, among us. And, this starts with the episode Lamentation, and then powers, principalities, thrones, and dominions, and then sort of carries over. I mean, Morgan and Wong sort of, they downplay that in the second season of Millennium, and then it sort of comes back in the third. So I think that's really like Carter's, like, I think he's more in tune and inclined. It's like he's almost like a medieval thinker at heart, and that's why this aborted series that he tried to do with Amazon, the After, was basically he wanted to base every episode of the series on a specific canto of the Divine Comedy. Dante's Divine Comedy. So I think that kind of shows really where more his thinking is at. He's concerned about the government stuff, the conspiracy stuff, the alien stuff, all that kind of thing, particularly the genetic science of it. But I think in his heart, he's like, almost like a classic medieval thinker, that he sees everything in the context of this struggle between, the powers, the principalities, the thrones and dominions, from that title of that Millennium episode. And I think that that's more of where his mind is at. So in the context of My Struggle, if you look at, this whole this whole Faustian idea that Fox Mulder is sort of like a Faustian character, and the cigarette smoking man is like Mephistopheles, in that regard. And you can sort of see episodes like Redux 2 where, you see it like an actual literal playing out of the whole Faust-Mephistopheles relationship. So I think in that regard, I think that really shows what Carter's thinking is. And I think that one of the reasons why, again, My Struggle is so weak, and certainly a lot of the season 9 mythology was rather terrible as well, is he just didn't care anymore. He just wasn't he had moved on. If you look at his big opus in season 9, it's God comes down because he wants to. It's probably the most synchronistic hour of television ever created, because the whole premise of the episode in season 9, Improbable, that he wrote and directed and starring Burt Reynolds, is basically that God is always throwing clues at us, and he's always speaking to us in riddles and symbols, and we have to figure out what the symbols are. We have to sort of retrace the steps. And if you listen to the the director's commentary for that episode, it's almost Neoplatonist. You know what I mean?
It is a very medieval way of seeing the world. You will find medieval thinkers who will say exactly that this is how God speaks.
Well, then that's literally what Carter said in that episode. And then, you zoom back, and it's whole thing with like toponymy and, like place magic and things like that. And what's his big opus this season is the whole thing with like the name game magic and this weird idea that I can't really get to the core of what his thinking is on it, but it's this whole idea of doppelgangers and doubles. And you see this, that absolutely train wreck, the absolute worst of the worst episode ever, Fight Club in the 7th season with Kathy Griffin, which is a whole other discussion as far as Chris Carter is concerned. But it's like the whole thing is like this weird thing about doubles and doppelgangers and all this kind of thing. And it's like, is he talking about like that we are, living in the midst of a parallel universe, and what we call angels and demons are just these powers that are above us, but are among us because, there are doubles or something. I don't know. It's like he will never tell you. His thinking is so fractal and so, in some senses, disordered that you may never figure it out for yourself. But you obviously see that he's obviously having a very good time, throwing these little, breadcrumbs at you. So again, I think that, that the episodes that really interested me in this season, in that regard, are that episode again, Familiar, with these hideous children's TV shows that those hideous Teletubby characters and that Mr. Chuckleteeth, and it's interesting because if you have kids like I do, like a lot, it's kind of this feeling you get when you watch a lot of these shows. It's like, this is actually rather terrifying and horrible, and it's being packaged as children's entertainment. And Teletubbies is a perfect example. Teletubbies is basically like druidic sex magic symbolism, for babies. It's the craziest and weirdest thing you've ever seen. And I think most people just don't look past the surface of it. But if you just dig a little bit, just like scrape a little bit of that dust off the windshield, it's like, that's a sick, fucked up show. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
So it's certainly like, that's a very late period. It's like, that would have been like much more germane to explore in the original incarnation of the show. But I still appreciate it and I think a lot of people who watch it still appreciate it because, we're part of that generation and that mindset. But also, that episode with like the Hollywood vampires, in the spirit.
Nothing Lasts Forever. Those are my two favorites. Yeah.
The spirit cooking episode.
But that was
like
just
this Marina Abramovich character, and it's just like, it's like, oh my god, it's like they went there, but then they have this like Buffy character in it.
Well, so Familiar, the witchcraft one with the demonic Teletubbies. There's an episode of Angel that's basically the same, where he gets turned into a puppet on a kids show because there's this kids show that is demons, and it's harvesting life energy off the kids who watch it during the TV. And I looked at episodes 8 and 9, it was like watching Buffy and Angel again as well. It was like, let's just bring back all the 90s TV classics, but they were such good episodes. I think Familiar and I guess gold, silver, bronze for me is Familiar, Nothing Lasts Forever, +1. Like, I think there's some good stuff in season 11 for people.
I love it. I mean, I'm, obviously incredibly biased, and I think maybe more casual fans might like it, but maybe people who just like watched it because it was popular in the 90s, whatever, probably won't really get much out of it. I mean, David and Gillian look considerably older now. I mean, particularly Gillian. I mean, she's certainly a very handsome middle-aged woman, but she's not the ingenue she once was. She's not the the pillowy-lipped, angel-faced prodigy that she was. And it's like, that's not, I'm not trying to be ageist here, but it's just, that's naturally going to impact your experience of the stories, because, it starts off as this, these two incredibly gorgeous individuals, who are all super smart and super motivated, trying to change the world. And what we're seeing in this revival here is like, the world is beyond changing. The world is irredeemable. This
is what I think, because we got to finish that up. I think that's the kind of, if there's a message with a capital M across them, as in, this is Chris Carter's opinion of, like, that's what I mean. Like, there's the where are they now of the show, and then there's the where are you idiots now? Like, the truth is out there is no longer a viable kind of mission statement, because we are where we are. In that sense, I guess I'm glad they've aged. It works better. Skinner looks more or less the same creep that he is. Maybe he's the actual vampire. But yes, it's so funny. When you watch series 1, you think, my goodness, did somebody have to drive these actors to set? They look so young.
Oh, yeah. Especially, and it's interesting because they couldn't quite figure out how they wanted to style Scully in the early episodes. But there are a couple episodes where she has like very minimal makeup. And the episode I'm thinking is one of my favorites, which is Conduit. And that's about the boy who's receiving messages from his abducted alien sister through the television. It's sort of a poltergeist thing there. But there are just scenes where, like, Gillian literally looks 12 years old. Yeah. I mean, she just looks like a child. And it's funny because the Gillian that we came to know and love, it has an interesting genesis, because what had happened with Gillian is that they always kind of wanted to make her not look glam. Not look beautiful, not look stylish, not look like very heavily made up. But what had happened in the second season is that she had her baby and she was exhausted all the time, and she had like really dark circles under her eyes. So they kept having to really make her up to cover up the fact that she had, obviously looked so fatigued. And that sort of like, oh, well, she looks really good like this. She looks really hot. Let's just go in this direction. And then by like the fifth season, she's so gorgeous. It's like it's kind of hard to look at her, in some shots, because she's just so beautiful. It's like so radiant. And it's just interesting how these things kind of take on a life of their own. So, as far as like, getting back to the series, it's like Nothing Lasts Forever. It's like, I think that there was a much better episode in there. It was written by a protege of Glenn Morgan, who's the co-executive producer on this season. And I really felt like that this was more of like a Glenn Morgan script. Maybe she had the premise and she did the rewrites and, so on and so forth. But I felt like Glenn Morgan's spirit in a lot of this, and sort of that kind of like that pulpy, that he did that film, The One, with James Wong, the sort of Jet Li movie. There's a sort of like that Buffy sense. And
well, because he did the one I didn't especially like, which was when they get trapped in the sushi restaurant and then get followed by robots. So he did that one, didn't he? Glenn Morgan?
Yeah, well, everybody seemed to love that. And I was like, I thought that was very... Yeah, well, I thought it was entertaining, but I was just like, this could literally be anybody. This could literally be anybody. It could be like, it doesn't even have to be like an FBI agent. It just could literally be anybody playing out this story. It could literally just be like a Black Mirror episode that takes place in London, or it could literally be a story that takes place, with just two random people out on a date in Tokyo. It could have been anything. I mean, it was a very cute premise, and I thought it was very, very well done, but it wasn't, necessarily X-Files. And that's sort of like, it's interesting because everybody's like, well, the story's got to be wrapped up. It's got to be resolved. It's like, you idiots. It was resolved back in 2001.
That's exactly. That's kind of where I wanted to go with it. And it's weird. So a lot of the shows that I've done personal analysis on because I like them, and Buffy and Angel are included in that. I think My Struggle 4 is rushed, regardless. I think that's in there. You've changed my opinion of it. I didn't think it was bad, but I like it better now, and I'm going to watch it again. But what you notice with long-running shows like this is that the farewell actually starts about 4 episodes before, and you kind of get, like, there's some cute bits in that sushi episode, like towards the end when they're talking and Mulder's like, how come your house is so much nicer than mine? Which is cute. But, and the familiar episode was just that really nice, wandering around in the woods, there's fog, children are in danger, kind of classic X-Files. And Nothing Lasts Forever is literally called Nothing Lasts Forever. And that's the penultimate episode. And then you get My Struggle 4. So I do think they got to kind of, I like season 11 because they got to play with the form. They got to like the bits they liked. And I do, if people are kind of on the fence going, I liked it originally, I'm not sure where I feel about 10 and 11. 11 is a nice farewell, I think.
Yeah, I was entertained, and I'll tell you, my expectations of it could just have not been lower. Like I could not have had lower expectations. I was actually kind of dreading it, and I was even kind of dreading My Struggle 4 because I was just like, I was enjoying these episodes, and I loved how they really captured the essence of that. What they used to call it the Sherlock Holmes, and that's that really rich and like vibrant and pulsating energy that the climate of Vancouver really offers people, and that's why so many shows film there. I loved how they didn't try to just make it look like a 90s show. The cinematography was the palettes were much denser, the colors were more complex. It really gave you like this very immersive kind of sense as far as the photography, cinematography, and the direction. Particularly when Carter directed again. I mean, My Struggle 4. I mean, the comparison I made is like to a Terrence Malick film, where it's like these human dramas playing up, against this huge sky. It's just a sky, this rich and mottled and multivariant sky that you see over Vancouver. It just seems to fascinate him in that sense. And we saw that, back as far back as Postmodern Prometheus with his direction. So it's like this whole idea, this has got to be resolved, and everybody's like, where's this story going? And it's like, this 10 and 11 were not about where this story is going and it's going to be resolved. Yeah. Because the story, like I said, I mean, you can't even say the 9th season was about that, because what they had done back in the 8th season, and I'll just give people a little bit of nerdy inside baseball here, is that, there was a real strong sense that the show was kind of on its, it's on its way out in the 7th season, particularly with David leaving. And then, like, the 8th season really gave it a shot in the arm, and everybody was really juiced and really energized. And, Robert Patrick really brought this, like, kind of fresh new feeling to the show, and everybody was really happy. But it was also a sense, Carter was, like, exhausted. Carter, it was, like, literally the first guy there and the last guy to leave every day for 9 years at this point. And that really can kill you. That can literally kill you. That can just drop you on the floor, that kind of schedule. So he was exhausted. David was like, well, I'm having fun working with Robert Patrick, but he and Gillian weren't getting along. He wasn't really happy with where the story was going as far as like this baby storyline and everything. So he was on his way out. And then Gillian had originally wanted the 8th season to be her last, but then she re-signed this new contract because she felt she'd been underpaid, all these years, and wanted to sort of be, remunerated for all her efforts and her, central role in the success of the series. So, but the problem is that the 9th season is that everybody wanted to just leave Mulder and Scully and all the rest of that behind, but they had to sort of just drag it out of mothballs, even though they thought they had worked all season in the 8th season to wrap it up. And then, they have to drag it around. And then, the thing that really bothered everybody is that, Scully was really the fifth wheel, because they wanted to sort of reinvent the whole believer skeptic dynamic with Doggett and Reyes, because, Scully really couldn't be a functional skeptic anymore after spending 3 episodes on the beach with, a giant alien spaceship that's basically God. How can she just go back to oh, Mulder, those aren't UFOs, this whole kind of thing. So they wanted to sort of recreate that dynamic of the of the early seasons. And everybody thought that, Annabeth Gish and Robert Patrick had this really good chemistry, but there's Scully, and just reminding everybody just how more exciting and fresh it was back in the old days. And, her storylines need to be serviced. And now we've got to keep this whole Mulder thing going, and nobody wanted to do that, and blah, 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 blah. So, really, the storyline that everybody wants to be wrapped up is wrapped up in season 8. And if you want, you can just skip the entirety of season 9 and just go to the the denouement. It's sort of like the coda, which is, I want to believe, which is okay, they fought the law and the law won, that kind of feeling. It's like they tried to change the system and the system crushed them. But nobody wants to see that. Everybody wants them back in their power suits, running around with with the flashlights and everything. So again, it's like the story was resolved 17 years ago, and it didn't really, it probably would have been better to not drag it out of mothballs again. I'm sure Carter would have preferred that, but I'm sure a lot of this is the network saying, "Listen, we're paying you a lot of money. Keep this circus on the road."
Yeah, I'm glad they did, in retrospect, as long as I can think of it as a coda or an after credit sequence or something. And as you say, don't expect it to, because he said it, and he said it really well. What more can you expect of someone? He gave you a whole bunch of stuff that turned out to be true. And, I think it's fine that they can have, I think if you look at it that way, season 10 and 11, especially 11, although there's some good bits in 10, I think if you look at it that way, because we've got to wind this one up, I've kept you way too late, there's a lot of stuff you can enjoy in season 11 as long as you don't want it to be that white-hot, disclosey zeitgeist thing that it once was.
Well, and again, just to get back to what I was saying before, it's telling you, with the Darren Morgan episode, and Darren Morgan was always like Chris Carter's project, because Chris, he wrote Humbug back in the 2nd season, and Chris Carter loved it and said, okay, just sit in a room and write whatever you want. You don't have to come to meetings. You don't have to come to story conferences. You don't have to come to, storyboard meetings, all this kind of thing. Just sit in a room. And, he got a deal. And I think in some ways it kind of crippled Morgan's development as a writer, because, as we all know, that he did very little after the X-Files, and he never really sort of broke out of that Darren Morgan episode kind of thing, and I think he would almost assuredly have the talent to do other kinds of stories if, he was willing to challenge himself. But, he was, he became like Chris Carter's sort of like hemophiliac prince in a way, and sort of kept in a chamber and, allowed to just spend as much time as he wanted, because Carter really loved these episodes that he did. And I think in this sense, I think that, I'm not sure exactly how much interplay they had, but I'm sure that Carter, because that whole idea that he's putting forth, that there is no more truth, it's like everything is, there's no speaking truth to power anymore, because power is its own truth. And that's really kind of like, to me, what the it's not a message that anyone wants to hear necessarily, but I think that's sort of the underlying message of these past two seasons is like, there's no romantic Romeo and Juliet that are going to save the world for us, because the world is it's just beyond saving. The world is irredeemable. I mean, we are in a Gnostic world. We are living in a Gnostic reality. We're living in a reality that, the Gnostics had the foresight to predict, 2,000 years ago, and it's taken the rest of us this long to come, to come upon the truth, to sort of lose our illusions that, the Justice League is waiting up in the skies for us to solve our problems for us. Just like the cavalry come in at the last minute, and the Gnostics like, no, it's not going to happen. And, and I think that people are coming around to that realization now.
Well, on that cheery note, for people who haven't watched it yet, watch it with some liquor.
Sure, and maybe listen to like some Oasis albums, or Semisonic or Nirvana records. Just if you want to give yourself the flavor, have a little like '90s party, and bust out your grunge wear, and
well, Chris,
you'll have a lot more fun.
This has really opened up season 11 for me. I think, particularly My Struggle 4, which I shall rewatch with new eyes probably this evening. You need no introduction, which is why I didn't really introduce you. But for somehow, if people are unaware where they find you moving forward, what do they do?
secretsun.blogspot.com, which is been on fire lately. We've been, I think that after a period of some personal issues and things like that, we're sort of the zeitgeist has come around to. It's caught up with the Secret Sun. I keep saying, 2018, 2017, but certainly now 2018, because, it's the same thing. I always felt like 2017 was like, a year that got really high and spend like, a month reading Secret Sun archives, because it's like everything that I was writing about 10 years ago is here and now, and on, the front page of all these newspapers and websites and all these things like that. It's, it would almost be fun if it wasn't so terrifying, but, whatever. It's,
this is where
the reality. Yeah, this is the reality we're living in. And, you can either enjoy it, enjoy the ride, or you can put your head in the sand, which I think a lot of people are doing these days. Nice.
Well, this is great. I love this I love this chat, and I needed to get to the bottom of what I thought about season 11. So, who better to ask than your good self? And, thank you very much.
My pleasure.